Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now that we've talked about how to graph a picture of an entire economy, and that graph includes three curves, I want to zoom in on one of those three curves and take a look at a part of an economy and answer the question, what is aggregate demand? Now, in this case, we're not going to use the US as an example. We'll go to another country. Let's think about Sweden for a minute, and this could be a drawing that you would do for the Swedish economy. For the aggregate demand curve, just like other curves, it's a collection of possible points we can be at, of course. Only in this case, we're looking at all prices rather than an individual price like you would have in an individual market, and the quantity of all things being demanded, or in other words, real GDP. And that's really what aggregate demand is. It's the demand for all products and services produced inside a country. And think of it as the C plus the I plus the G plus the NX that we talked about using the expenditures approach to calculate GDP. The circular flow helps us visualize this. The C is consumers or households. The I is firms or companies. The G is government. And NX refers to exports minus imports. So if we're thinking about the demand for all products and services produced by Sweden, then we're talking about all the consumers in Sweden or the households that want to buy Swedish stuff and services, all the companies, Swedish government, but of course other countries, the exports piece of the Swedish economy. And so these are different price points that could prevail based on other factors when it comes to the demand for Swedish stuff and Swedish services. But I want to go a little bit further here, talk about why an aggregate demand curve is sloped that way, not just in Sweden, of course, but why is an AD curve sloped downward from left to right? Why, in other words, do we have this indirect or inverse relationship between price and quantity, just like we did in the case of the demand curve for a market? Or more specifically, why do we have this indirect relationship between price level and the quantity of real GDP? Well, there's three explanations that I want you to know. Before I go into this, I want to let you know that increasingly more this semester we're going to start to use symbols as a way of shorthand to save time. But as much as you're welcome to use them in your notes, don't use symbols when you're answering a free response question, whether it's in this class or on the AP exam. Write out longhand what those symbols mean. Now, as it says here, this arrow that points to the right in shorthand means leads to, ceteris paribus. So in other words, in the first explanation, we have some kind of variable that changes, in theory, would lead to a change in another variable, ceteris paribus. So that being said, let's talk about the reasons why the curve is drawn downward from left to right. The first explanation is the real balance effect, which is a fancy way of saying purchasing power increases or decreases when the price level increases or decreases. Stop and think about this for a second. Let's say that the price level decreases, or in other words, prices go down in the Swedish economy. What happens to the purchasing power that the average Swedish citizen or somebody in another country that's buying Swedish stuff, that's under the NX part of the demand curve, what happens for them? Well, they have an increase in purchasing power. They can afford to buy more products and services. If prices go up, then of course the purchasing power of the people that are demanding those products and services decreases. So if we go back to our curve, of course, that's one explanation for this relationship. Let's say we're at point E and then prices start to go up. Well, because people's purchasing power decreases, they can't afford to buy as much, so the quantity is going to decrease, and that's why we get to some point like point A, for instance. The same is also true in reverse. If we're up here at point A, prices start to decrease, people are going to demand more. The quantity of real GDP that's demanded by consumers, by businesses, by the government, by other countries is going to increase. Let's look at two other explanations for why the curve is drawn that way. Another explanation is known as the interest rate effect. Right? With the interest rate effect, we say that if prices go up, then that's going to lead to an increase in the real interest rate, which ultimately leads to a decrease in people borrowing to buy. So stop and think about this. If prices increase, one of those prices in the price level, because it's supposed to include all prices, all markets, one of those prices is supposed to be the price of loans. Little r, if you remember, is the interest rate or the real interest rate in the loanable funds market. So if all prices are going up, one of those prices is the real interest rate in the loanable funds market. As that price starts to go up for long-term loans, loans of more than 1 year, fewer and fewer people can afford to take those loans to buy stuff. Prices are going up, and one of those prices is the real interest rate. People like me that might be thinking about buying a new car or buying a new home, these kinds of things that you need to take loans for the long term, can afford that less and less. Visualize that. If you've got the loanable funds market, here was the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds, and the price starts to go up. Okay, people can afford less and less. Now, one of the reasons this price could go up is because people need to borrow more. If prices are going up, more and more people will not have as much cash needed because their purchasing power is decreasing to buy what they want, so they might start to demand more loans. So if DLF sub 2 emerges, so demand shifts to the right, what does that happen? What happens to the price of loanable funds? We go from R sub 1 to R sub 2. And, of course, people can borrow less. If you're one of the first people to get into that market and take a long-term loan, good for you, but not everybody can be first. So some of the people that come into this market after that change takes place go, gosh, look at the price of loans. They're skyrocketing. I can't afford to take a loan, and I can't afford to buy as much of the stuff as I used to, all thanks to the fact that the price level has increased. Now, let's say the opposite occurs. If the prices across the entire Swedish economy start to decline, then of course the opposite's going to happen. One of those prices would be the real interest rate. That begins to fall, but also people, because prices are down, don't need to borrow as much. The price is going to be down on the real interest rate for the real interest rate in the loanable funds market. All of that leads to an increase in borrowing to buy. People can afford to take more loans to buy more stuff. So times are good. Times are good to borrow money. Times are good just to buy stuff because prices are down. Now, the last explanation that we have for the relationship between these two variables on the aggregate demand curve is the international trade effect, and it's very simple. All right, thinking back to the NX of aggregate demand as part of the expenditures approach to calculating GDP, if price level goes down, do you think people in other countries can afford to buy more or less of our exports? More, of course. Prices increase, then they'll purchase less of our exports.